Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take a whole stack of information, sift through it all, and really try to pull out the core insights for you.
Giving you that clearer picture without you having to wade through everything yourself.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into something really quite significant and incredibly timely, I think. It's a major interview with Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki.
A really wide-ranging one.
It is. And this is just part one of our look at it. We're going to focus specifically here on what he has to say about global and regional issues. It's sort of the foundation, for how he sees everything else playing out.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about the timing. Given how quickly things are changing globally, getting this perspective is fascinating. President Afwerki brings, well, a really unique viewpoint.
Shaped by decades of experience, right?
Decades of direct involvement. Yeah, it's not just theory for him. It's lived history from a nation that's often been, right at the crossroads of these major power struggles. It gives you a lens to understand maybe not just what's happening, but why.
Right. So our mission here, for you listening, is really to pull out those key nuggets, those important insights from this really extensive discussion. Think of it as your shortcut to getting a solid grasp on the president's perspective on where the world is heading.
Helping connect some dots on these really complex geopolitical issues.
Exactly. So let's get straight into it. Where does he begin? Tag I. The Cold War legacy and the birth of unipolarity. Well, interestingly, before diving into the main topics, President Afwerki kind of sets the stage. He stresses how crucial things like clarity, relevance, and strategic focus are for nation building.
Especially focusing on internal affairs, right? Sustained commitment there.
Yes, but he immediately frames that by saying it all has to be understood against this backdrop of really sensitive global and regional developments. You get the sense of a leader deeply considering his nation's path in what he sees as a pretty turbulent world.
And it's crucial, as you said, to grasp Eritrea's historical stance here, which he emphasizes right away. For nearly 60 years, first the EPLF, the Liberation Front, and then the government itself, they've consistently pushed for a specific kind of international order, one based on justice, peace, inclusivity.
Equality between nations.
Exactly. Equal treatment, dignity, no external interference. This isn't some new policy for them. It's like a core belief system that goes way back. And it really shapes how they view the Cold War and its aftermath. That history is key.
And he doesn't just mention the Cold War in passing. He paints it as this, nearly 50-year period of intense rivalry. Soviet Union versus the U.S.-led West.
Brutal rivalry, often.
Yeah. And he sees it not as ancient history, but as something that fundamentally shaped the world we're in now, leaving these deep marks on global power structures. He wants us to see it through the eyes of nations that, really bore the brunt.
Definitely. And the consequences of that era, he argues, were huge for everyone, but especially for the global South. He brings it right back to Eritrea's own history, which was, frankly, painful. Well, after World War II, Eritrea was an Italian colony. Logically, it should have become independent, like many others, but geopolitical calculations took over. Big power politics.
You mean figures like Foster Dulles?
Precisely. John Foster Dulles, the U.S. Secretary of State back then, he was worried about Soviet influence. There's the infamous quote where he basically says, yeah, maybe justice says Eritrea should be independent, but our strategic interests, peace, mean it should be linked with Ethiopia.
Wow. So decisions made purely based on Cold War strategy, ignoring the Eritrean people.
Completely ignoring their rights, their self-determination. And Afwerki draws this direct line from those kinds of decisions back then to the problems we still see in the Middle East today. Borders drawn, fates decided by external powers for strategic reasons.
And he argues that the basic things nations want, peace, development, partnerships that actually benefit both sides, were just fundamentally at odds with Cold War thinking.
Absolutely. He saw those two blocs, the U.S.-led and the Soviet-led, as representing these clashing ideologies and interests that just trampled on the rights of smaller nations. They were antithetical to those universal desires.
And he makes it crystal clear Eritrea wasn't just watching this happen. He says, and this is a direct quote, "We in Eritrea were not passive spectators. We lived through it. We paid the price."
It's visceral, isn't it?
It really is. We endured the violence, the hardship, and the sacrifices required to defend our rights, our freedom, and our sovereignty. It hammers home that this isn't academic for him. It's about their national struggle, their identity.
That lived experience is just fundamental to his whole worldview. And he points out this historical coincidence, as he calls it. Eritrea finally wins independence in the early 90s.
Right, when the Cold War is ending.
Exactly. But he stresses that didn't just wipe the slate clean. The ideological baggage, the memories, the legacies of that era, they persisted. The basic demands for justice and equality didn't change, but suddenly the global context shifted, presenting brand new challenges.
So, as they achieved independence, they were immediately questioning this new unipolar world. What did it actually mean?
Pretty much. What ideologies would it really follow? And what's fascinating, as you said, is how he sees those historical echoes still shaping things today. He traces the roots of current global instability right back to the unresolved issues and, frankly, the flawed assumptions of that transition period.
Okay, so after the Cold War, there was this hope, right? A hope for a better world order, a peace dividend.
Yeah, a more rational structure.
But President Afwerki argues the way the Soviet Union collapsed actually sent the wrong signal to the West, that it led to bad policies.
Precisely. His take is quite provocative. He says the Soviet collapse wasn't really a victory for Western strategy or ideology. It was more about internal problems, like perestroika, Gorbachev's reforms.
Internal implosion, basically.
Yeah. But the West, particularly the US and the EU-led NATO bloc, misinterpreted it as this definitive triumph. This, he says, bred a kind of, well, misguided triumphalism.
A belief that their model was the only way forward, the end of history idea.
Exactly that. The idea of an inevitable unipolar world dominated by Western liberal democracy and market economics. But he argues this whole notion was based on a miscalculation. It wasn't proof of the West's inherent strength, just a misreading of a moment in time.
But that sense of victory drove policy for decades.
He says it dictated global policy for 30 years, and he asks, did it actually deliver peace, development, justice? His answer is a clear no, because in his view, it wasn't about ideals. It was about asserting unchallenged power.
And he gives pretty stark examples of how this played out. He uses terms like organized plunder, domination, coercion.
He doesn't hold back. He argues this dominance meant systematically exploiting resources, especially in the global south.
So countries rich in minerals or strategically located.
Found themselves subjected to policies or pressures that served external interests, not their own development. It was about control, he says, exerted through force, economic manipulation, political pressure, not genuine partnership.
And he sees this happening everywhere. Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America.
Even within Europe and North America, he suggests. Through pushing certain economic models or political alignments, it wasn't cooperation, it was a drive for unilateral control. That's how he defines the unipolar era.
And then he loops it right back to Eritrea, asking, what wounds did this period inflict on us? What obstacles did it place in our path? Making it clear this isn't abstract theory.
Right. It connects directly to their own struggle. He shows this continuity moving from their 50-year fight for liberation straight into battling the pressures of this new unipolar world. It really highlights how deep this historical perspective runs for them. #tag2. The unraveling of the unipolar dream.
Okay, so we've got the historical context. Afwerki's view of the unipolar order is flawed from the start. But what are the consequences? This is where you said it gets really interesting.
Yeah, because he describes the last 30 years not as stable or harmonious, but as marked by increasing instability, upheavals, violence, and this renewed, almost frantic scramble for influence.
Particularly in strategic regions. A very different picture from the end of history.
Totally different. And he argues quite strongly that this didn't get rid of old Cold War ideologies. It actually intensified them, just maybe with different players or dynamics.
So he looks at U.S. policy across different administrations. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden.
Yes, and he asks us to look for the patterns. What were the consistent behaviors? What were the outcomes? He does the same for European policies, questioning the roles of NATO and the EU during this time.
Challenging us to look beyond their stated goals.
Exactly, to look at the actual results on the ground. He sees a consistent pattern of intervention, of imposition, that he argues didn't create stability but actually made tensions worse.
And he brings in the rise of China here, too.
Yeah, he specifically asks, how did China rise so dramatically? He places its ascent right within the context of those flawed unipolar assumptions, suggesting that the very effort to maintain that unipolarity, ironically, helped create the space for China for multipolarity to emerge.
So what's his big takeaway from these 3 decades?
It's stark. He says the dream of uncontested power has resulted in 30 years of loss and escalating crises. plain and simple.
And he blames this on a failure to build a viable New World Order after the Cold War.
Directly. He believes the architects of that unipolar moment were so caught up in their perceived victory that they just failed to deal with the reality of a complex multipolar world and the legitimate aspirations of other nations. It's a damning assessment of the whole unipolar experiment, not a success, but a period of missed opportunities and deepening global problems.
So if this unipolar dream led to instability, what does that mean for the main players now? Afwerki sees this order, built on shaky ground, starting to unravel.
Visibly unraveling, yes. And he points to significant internal flaws, major weaknesses within the Western Bloc itself, led by the U.S.
Oh, so what weaknesses?
He asks some really fundamental questions about their core institutions, like, is NATO still relevant? What have its actual impact been, its legacy, especially in places like the Middle East or North Africa?
And the EU.
Same question. Does it still represent the ideals it claimed would underpin this unipolar world? Or has it become something else? He sees these questions as highlighting a deep fragility, sort of an internal decay within the very structures meant to uphold that dominance. The contradictions are becoming too obvious.
And he's quite critical of U.S. policies over this time, including right now, looking at the actual results, especially economically.
Very much so. He points to something like Trump's Make America Great Again slogan. He doesn't see it as an outlier, but as proof that previous policies failed to maintain that unmatched global economic dominance.
Citing economic data.
Yeah, arguing the U.S. isn't the undisputed leader it once was. Things like imposing tariffs. He sees that as a sign of anxiety, not strength. The huge national debt, a weaker position in industrial growth, access to resources, even technological supremacy, once taken for granted, is now being contested.
So the slogan itself signals a recognition of decline.
That's his argument. That the need for such a slogan points to an awareness of decline within the U.S. itself. He even questions the actual military strength of the West compared to the rapid advances of powers like China and Russia, suggesting a gap between perception and reality.
And he uses that Elon Musk example, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE,
Yeah, it's a fascinating specific detail he brings in.
as a sign of these deeper weaknesses.
Exactly. The idea that the supposedly richest, most powerful nation needs to bring in private figures to basically scrutinize government spending. He sees that as a sign of systemic inefficiency, a deep financial strain.
Reinforcing his point that the unipolar dream wasn't sustainable internally either.
Right. That the economic model supporting it, while looking dominant on the outside, had these fundamental internal weaknesses. He's essentially saying, look closer, the cracks are right there.
Okay, so these internal weaknesses, the system under strain. Afwerki argues the Ukraine crisis really brings this into sharp focus. It's like a case study for these bigger shifts.
Precisely. He sees it as accentuating that underlying fragility. And his analysis of the conflict is, well, very detailed and quite direct.
How does he break it down?
He says it reveals the true face of global alignments, and crucially, those unresolved ideological legacies of the Cold War. He goes back to the old containment doctrine.
Which was aimed at the Soviet Union originally.
Right. To stop the spread of communism, Soviet influence. Afwerki argues that doctrine wasn't abandoned after the Cold War. It was just repurposed and applied directly to Russia.
So the goal remained ensuring no rival could match the West.
That's his interpretation. Militarily, economically, technologically. He argues the Ukraine crisis stems directly from this long-term containment strategy, suggesting the conflict was perhaps an almost inevitable result of pushing that policy. He sees Ukraine essentially as the battlefield for these deep-seated competing ideologies.
The proxy war, basically.
A proxy for a much larger geopolitical struggle, and he really emphasizes that Ukraine isn't fighting alone. He asks, where are the trillions of dollars coming from?
Not from Ukraine's own resources.
Right, whose weapons are being used, whose military tech is being tested daily. For him, the answers make it obvious. This is NATO, the U.S.-led West, versus Russia. The scale of outside involvement makes it undeniable in his view.
And Russia's response, according to him.
He says Russia is actively forging its own alliances, rethinking its strategies, asserting itself in this struggle, diversifying economic ties, strengthening military links outside the West, challenging that unipolar narrative. It's a major realignment happening in plain sight.
Okay, so if Ukraine reveals these cracks in the post-Cold War ideology, what specific structural failures does he point to? How does he link it back to that unipolar dominance idea?
He gets quite specific, especially around military spending and burden sharing. He sees that as a key failure. Take NATO's budget.
The U.S. has carried the lion's share for years.
Historically, like 80%. Now, with Ukraine, there's immense pressure on European NATO members to drastically increase their defense spending. 2% of GDP isn't enough anymore. Now it's talk of 4, 5, even 6%.
Can they sustain that?
That's the question he raises. The U.S. can't keep shouldering that burden alone indefinitely, he argues. Can European nations actually afford these massive hikes, especially with their own economic pressures? And then there's the issue of where the weapons come from.
If they rearm, they buy American.
Predominantly, yes. High-end systems from the U.S., which, in his view, keeps wealth flowing back to the U.S. and maintains a kind of dependency. It raises huge questions about the sustainability of the whole military-industrial complex and the economic impact of this escalating spending, not just for the U.S., but for its allies, too.
So these aren't just minor budget issues for him. They point to the unsustainability of the whole model.
Absolutely. He's saying these details underscore this profound transition we're in. The economic and military costs of trying to maintain that unipolar dominance are just becoming too high, even for the most powerful.
Okay, let's broaden the focus beyond the U.S. and Europe. What about China? How does President Afwerki see China's role in this changing global picture?
It's a really interesting take. He argues that the initial U.S. policy, the one focused on containing Russia first, which he sees as a direct hangover from the Cold War, actually backfired in a way.
How so?
Well, he says it didn't really weaken Russia significantly, but it did inadvertently create this huge opening for China. While the West was preoccupied with Russia, China was able to grow stronger economically, militarily, technologically, in global influence, almost without facing that direct containment pressure itself.
And now China's arguably in a leading position globally in many areas.
He suggests exactly that. Manufacturing, tech, infrastructure. He sees it as a direct outcome of that initial focus on Russia, allowing China to effectively fill a power vacuum.
Which leads to this policy shift we're seeing now in the U.S., right? Focusing more on China as the primary threat, with Russia maybe secondary.
It's a massive recalibration, and he suggests it's causing major debates within the U.S. administration and policy circles.
Debates about how to handle both.
Yeah. He describes some strategists apparently considering this, well, audacious idea of maybe neutralizing Russia, even trying to ally with it somehow to better confront China.
Wow, like a Nixon to China reversal.
Kind of reminiscent of that, yeah. But then others are arguing forcefully, no, we have to tackle both simultaneously. They're linked threats. He highlights all these competing power centers, think tanks, lobbyists pushing different options. It paints a picture of the U.S. foreign policy world really grappling with how to navigate this new, complex reality.
Which brings us to this idea he stresses, triangulation, the interplay between the U.S., China, and Russia.
Exactly. All three are UN Security Council permanent members, all have massive global influence. He says their interactions will define whatever new order emerges.
And he believes the shift in the balance of power is already undeniable.
Absolutely. He says if you just look objectively at the global map, economics, military power, tech influence, diplomacy, the shift is clear. It's not just theory, it's happening now. Trade patterns, military drills, diplomatic alignments all show it. He's essentially saying, forget the old bipolar view. We're in a much more complex three-way dynamic.
And he leaves us with this big question. Are the major powers actively trying to shape this transition, to accelerate it towards something new, or is it just a chaotic unraveling?
Right. Is there a plan, or is it just everyone scrambling for advantage as the old system breaks down? It's a critical question about intent versus reaction.
So, summing up this analysis of the last 30 years, President Afwerki seems convinced we're nearing, as he puts it, the final hour of this Western-led experiment.
Yeah, he seems quite certain about that. His conclusion is that the whole unipolar idea was always unrealistic, and more importantly, it just hasn't delivered peace, justice, or stability for most of the world.
The consequences are just becoming too obvious now.
That's his point. Escalating conflicts, economic instability, the dangers are visible. He states it very clearly. The bigger issue now is finding a replacement. The old order cannot continue, because it failed on those fundamental aspirations. The system is broken, and everyone knows it now.
Okay, but the crucial follow-up then is, where do we go from here? Are we actually building something new or just drifting? He mentions all these summits and meetings.
Yeah, BRICS summits, high-level meetings, diplomatic initiatives. He calls them almost public relations activities.
Implying they lack substance.
He asks the tough question. Beyond the headlines and the photo ops, is there a clear, coherent roadmap, a real strategic vision for a genuinely new world order? he sounds, frankly, pretty skeptical.
So what principles does he think a new order needs?
He lays them out very clearly. It has to categorically reject economic exploitation and coercion. It needs to be built on genuine mutual cooperation, voluntary solidarity, respect for international law, and crucially, the absolute sovereignty and independence of every single state, big or small.
But he sees a big gap between those ideals and reality.
A huge disconnect. He argues that many of these grand declarations coming out of summits sound good, but they often lack real substance, a practical plan, or a genuine commitment from the major players to actually uphold these principles. Often, he implies, it's more about appearing to do something than actually doing it.
So moving away from the big powers and their declarations, he shifts focus to the smaller or weaker nations, Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia.
Exactly. The very regions that hold so much of the world's natural wealth but remain marginalized and often suffer most from the instability.
Highlighting the irony there.
A bitter irony, yeah. Their resources make them targets for exploitation, he argues, but rarely partners on an equal footing. He points out that there's just no clear, coordinated plan from the major powers for a genuinely just global order that includes these continents equitably. Maybe some vague ideas, but no real guiding framework that breaks from that old extractive model.
Which makes you question the real intent behind talk of a new world order, right? Is it about justice or just rearranging the power deck chairs?
That's the underlying question, absolutely. And this leads him to pose what he calls the critical question for these marginalized nations. It's not just about what the big powers are doing, and he emphasizes this, what we are doing, meaning what are these nations themselves doing?
What's the challenge he sees for them?
He puts it bluntly. Their collective awareness and strength haven't yet reached a point where they can be truly effective, sustainable actors in driving this transformation. There's growing awareness, yes, but it hasn't yet solidified into a shared strategic vision or a comprehensive framework from their perspective.
So things remain blurred. The path forward is unclear.
Unclear because that strong, unified voice and strategy from the marginalized majority isn't fully formed yet, in his view. He's certain the current global order is unsustainable, but the alternative path, particularly for these nations, is still fragmented.
But despite that uncertainty, his conviction remains strong. The current system cannot last.
Absolutely unwavering on that. And he stresses this isn't some abstract debate for philosophers. It's about the fundamental desires of the world's peoples.
Peace, freedom from exploitation, cooperation.
Exactly, basic human aspirations. He argues these are natural desires, not tied to any specific ideology. As long as violence, injustice, economic looting exist, people will naturally oppose that order. But turning that opposition into a real transformation needs to be practical, tangible, inclusive. We can't just wait for future generations.
And he ties this back, finally, to Eritrea's own unique history. Their long struggle gives them insight.
He says very clearly, we know the terrain, we know the forces at play. Because of their history, he argues, Eritrea can't afford to be passive. While they focus internally, they must also build strong collaborations with like-minded nations across Africa within their region.
So the solution isn't just global, it's also regional and local, built step by step.
Yes, anchored in real experience and real commitment, moving beyond just talk. It's a very pragmatic call for unity in action, especially among those who've historically been pushed to the margins. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. That was a truly detailed journey through President Afwerki's perspective on the global situation. We've covered his view on the Cold War shadow, the flaws he sees in the unipolar dream, its unraveling causing instability. Ukraine is a key example.
The shifting power dynamics with the US, China, Russia, and this whole complex search for a new, more just world order. It's a perspective deeply rooted in history, but focused squarely on today.
It really is. And listening to your breakdown, it leaves me thinking, as these global power shifts happen, as the old order clearly falters, what role can the collective voice of those marginalized nations realistically play? How much power do they actually have to shape what comes next?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do those aspirations for justice and equity move beyond, summit declarations and PR exercises and become actual practical reality on the ground? And how long will that take? It's a huge challenge, not just for the powerful, but for the collective will of everyone else.
A question that definitely gives you, the listener, a lot to chew on as things continue to change. And remember, this was just part one, focusing on the big picture, global and regional issues.
There's more to unpack.
Definitely. So join us for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll get into more of the specifics, the regional and national implications that flow from this global analysis, according to President Afwerki. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive today.
Yeah, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.